A very warm good afternoon and greetings to everyone. On behalf of Global Research Foundation for Corporate Governance, I, Dr. Nidhi Kapoor, Platinum member of GRFCG, welcome our keynote speaker, Professor Tiltalolika, our dignitaries, senior academicians, and all the participants to this faculty development workshop. GRFCG was established in year 2019 to constantly engage with researchers, academicians, and practitioners operating in the realm of corporate governance. As work from home has become the new normal in the current pandemic situation, the Foundation took the initiative of launching an international webinar series for providing a platform for deliberations in varied areas of corporate governance. Keeping in line with its objective of building a learning environment, the Foundation has successfully organized 3 international webinars till now. The first webinar was held on 12th June 2020, where Dr. Gerhard Schneider, Director International Management in Louvain University, London, and Professor Jaiprakash Sharma, Founding Chairperson, GRFCG, former Head and Dean, Faculty of Commerce and Business, Delhi School of Economics, Delhi University, jointly deliberated on the topic Corporate Social Responsibility during COVID-19. The second webinar was organized on the case for radical reform of corporate governance on 15th July 2020, wherein Dr. Shan Turnbull shared interesting and thought-provoking insights on the topic. Dr. Shan is Principal, International Institute for Self-Governance in Sydney, Australia. The third webinar in the series was organized on 7th of August, wherein the speakers, Professor Gonzalo, a professor of corporate governance, strategic innovation, and family business at Catholic University of Chile, and Professor Magdalena Diaz Lefort, an economic historian and visiting fellow at Catholic University of Chile, deliberated on Minding the Corporate Governing Gap, the Institutional Construction of Corporate Governance in Latin America, Lessons for India. The Foundation has witnessed an overwhelming response from the participants in all the webinars. The feedback received has also been very encouraging. The recording of above said webinars is already available on the website of the Foundation in case you have missed it. So you can visit www.grfcg.in to look at the video recordings. Well, once again, I would like to announce a few protocols that need to be followed. Please, we are requesting you to keep your mic on mute and the video in the switch off mode. In case you get disconnected, the same link that has been mailed to you can be used to re-enter the meeting. And the same link will be there for tomorrow's session as well. You can pin the screen of the speaker where the slides are being shown in order to have a clear view. The queries can be put only through the chat box with the participant's name and affiliation. The host will ask queries on your behalf. Thank you. It is my pleasure to announce that today the Foundation is hosting the Faculty Development Workshop on academic writing in high impact factor journals. As academicians and researchers, we all the participants who are here understand the importance of making an effective research contribution in our respective fields. All of us work meticulously to get our research papers published in the renowned journals. Publications in ABTC listed or SCI listed journals is a matter of pride for any researcher, as they are not only having high impact factor, but also have a wide base of circulation amongst the academicians, researchers, and also amongst the industry professionals. These refereed journals follow a very rigorous review process, and the credibility of the research papers in these journals can be vouched for. On behalf of all the participants and members, I myself, being a member of GRFCG, would like to extend thanks to the Foundation and especially Professor Jaiprakash Sharma, who is the chairman of the Foundation, for giving us an opportunity to be a part of this workshop and learn about the various intricacies of having effective research publications. The present workshop will deal with the general requirements of academic writing for high impact journals in organization and management with a special emphasis on corporate governance. In today's session, the topics such as identification of an adequate research subject, developing a precise and promising research question, how to balance between the rigor and relevance, selecting an appropriate journal outlet, and preparing the manuscript for submission will be covered by our keynote speaker. The participants can keep posting their questions throughout the session in the chat box, and they will be answered from time to time by the speaker. I would like to take this opportunity to give a brief introduction of our speaker to the participants. Professor Till holds the chair of Organization and Management at the University of Erfurt, Germany, where currently he is also the Vice Dean of the Faculty of Economics, Law and Social Sciences. His main research expertise is in the areas of corporate governance, with a particular emphasis on codes of corporate governance, boards of directors, and top management teams and their organization. He has published widely in these areas in leading international journals. His dissertation thesis on corporate codes of ethics has been granted the Research Award by the Plansecker Foundation for Best Research in the field of business ethics. He is editor-in-chief of Corporate Governance and International Review, which is one of the most renowned journals in the areas of corporate governance. He's also senior editor of Management and Organization Review and serves on the editorial board of Organization Science. I would like to mention here that all these journals wherein Sir has published or is into the editorial board, all of them are listed in the ABDC list of journals under A or A star classification. Professor Till is also founding member and chairman of the board of International Corporate Governance Society, which provides a forum for rigorous research, teaching, and consulting for enhancing corporate governance practices and systems within the global economy. Sir, we are honored to have you amongst us as our speaker. I would now request Professor Jay Prakash Sharma, sir, founding chairperson of GRFCG, to open the session formally with his welcome address. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, good afternoon to everyone present here. Respected Professor Til Talaulkar, eminent members of the board of the foundation, distinguished participants, and the members of the core team. It is indeed a matter of pride and privilege for all of us that a globally renowned professor in the area of corporate governance and research, Professor Till, is here to talk on academic writing for high impact journal. We are extremely thankful to him and each of you for joining today and making this event remarkable. There is only one body across the globe doing a serious work in the area of corporate governance, which is International Corporate Governance Society, ICGS. And I'm very happy to share with you that Professor Till is the not only the founding director of this society, but also the chairman of this society since 2014. There is only one quality journal in the area of corporate governance titled Corporate Governance and International Review, which the research scholars across the globe consider a type of kind of Bible. And I am very happy to share with you all that Professor Till is the editor-in-chief of that journal. Not speaking much, on behalf of GRFCG, and on my own behalf, I extend a very warm and hearty welcome to him and each of you in this workshop organized by the foundation. When we opened the registration for this event, the condition laid down for registration was that the participant should have interest in the area of research and corporate governance, and should be either a faculty teaching this subject, or one pursuing research in this subject, did research or pursuing, published in this area. And I am very happy to share with you all that 124 participants registered for this workshop, out of which 105 are faculty members in teaching in various parts of the country, starting from Leh and Ladakh, from almost every state in the northeast side, whether it is Mizoram or Assam or the other parts of the northeast side, or up to south Chennai, this Tamil Nadu and Kerala and Karnataka and Maharashtra and Madhya Pradesh. So from everywhere, I see the participation in this event. Out of the total registered, we have around 35 to 40% from the NCR Delhi, and remaining participants are from outside Delhi. I first met the senior professor, Professor Till. It was in Boston. I met in a conference, followed by my meeting in India. When he was here he has been to India twice as a keynote speaker in a conference on corporate governance. So, and then I met him again in Italy in a conference. And last year, we interacted for more than an hour in UK. It was Colchester, UK, again in a conference on corporate governance organized by ICGS. And this time, when I contacted him to speak in a webinar in the month of July, initially he expressed his inability due to too many projects and commitments. But when I contacted him again in the month of August and told him that we are continuously receiving demand from research scholars to arrange a workshop on his forte area, that is academic writing for high impact journals, he readily agreed, and that shows his level of commitment towards promoting research. So, not taking that much time, on behalf of this foundation, GRFCG fraternity, once again, my heartfelt best wishes to all the participants. Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Nidhi, you
Thank
may,
you. Thank you, sir.
you may proceed.
Thank you so much, sir. I think all our research scholars and academicians are waiting to hear from Professor Till now. So over to you, sir. Please start with the session.
Yes, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome also from my side to this faculty development workshop organized by the Global Research Foundation for Corporate Governance. First of all, I would like to warmly thank Professor Sharma for his very kind invitation to join this faculty development workshop about writing for high impact journals, particularly in the field of corporate governance. Professor Sharma, thank you very much for having me here in this workshop. It's always a great pleasure to meet you. You have mentioned some of the occasions where our paths have crossed in the past, and I look very forward for many more paths to cross in the future. I'm also very happy actually to see how the Global Research Foundation for Corporate Governance develops. I also had the honor and the privilege to attend the first international conference of the GRFCG. Actually, I think it's almost or about 1 year ago that it was held in Delhi at a very nice venue. I was very, very privileged and honored also to participate in this first international conference, where I also had the opportunity to meet some of the board members of the foundation. I was impressed last year how quickly the foundation actually developed right after its startup. And I'm still impressed also to see how you were able to adjust to these new challenges that we all face because of COVID-19. So you were apparently unable, of course, to have a second international conference with people attending from all over India and all over the globe, but you were able to manage immediately to switch to this new format of webinars. And as Dr. Nidhi Kapoor also mentioned, this is already the fourth webinar that within a very, very short time frame you were able to organize and to host. So kudos on that. And I'm very happy to be part of this fourth webinar to be held today and tomorrow. Thank you very much also to Dr. Nidhi Kapoor for your very, very kind introduction and for hosting this session. So I'm very delighted about the warm words and the kind introduction that you provided. And of course, I also want to thank all the attendees that you take the time to participate in this workshop. Very grateful that you're interested in the subject, and we should make this workshop as a workshop of mutual learning. So I'm not intending to speak for the whole time of the workshop, but I'm really interested also, of course, in what questions you may have, what suggestions, what comments you may have. So let's try to make this as interactive as possible to make sure that we really mutually benefit from this two-day event. I think this is what I would share with you before starting. And now I will switch to the presentation slides. Then I will not be able to see you anymore. And I'm not able to see the Google Meets screen anymore. And this is why, as also Dr. Nidhi Kapoor has mentioned in the introduction, so when you have questions during the presentation, please write them down in the chat function of Google Meet. And I kindly ask Dr. Nidhi Kapoor to make sure that these questions are raised and to actually step in and to let me know the questions, particularly when there are clarification questions. We should immediately deal with clarification questions to make sure that there is no one lost, so to speak, on the way. And I think then we can, of course, without any problem, interrupt the presentation and try to clarify things that may need clarification. So thank you very much in advance. Again, Dr. Nidhi Kapoor, for also taking care of moderating these questions. Okay, I will now switch to the presentation. Can you see the presentation slides?
It is getting uploaded. Yes, sir. Now we can see it.
You can see
it. Is
it.
visible.
Okay, very, So whenever there are also, Dr. Kapoor, connectivity problems or so, please let me know.
Sure, sir, sure.
Because, I know I'm only able to see the slides and not what's going on in Google Meet.
Definitely, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. So our two-day workshop is about academic writing for high-impact journals. You all have an interest, apparently, in good research and in publishing in high-impact journals. That is why we all came together here for this two-day event. And we will spend these 2 days in order to, well, get some insights what we need to pay attention for when we strive for writing for or publishing in high impact journals. Before I start, let me share two news with you. One good news and one bad news. And I will start with the bad news. So there's certainly no one best way how to get published in high impact journals. And if you ask different scholars, they may provide different suggestions how to achieve this. But what probably everyone will agree about is it's a long journey and it's very hard work. So this is actually, so to speak, the bad news. There are no shortcuts. There are no golden tips that you simply have to follow and then you will succeed. The bad news is there are no shortcuts. It's hard work and it's a long journey. So what's the good news then? The good news is that nonetheless, there are some issues that we need to pay attention on in order to at least increase the likelihood to succeed, or in order to make it less likely the other way around, that our work is not considered for high impact journals, that our work is rejected after submission to high impact journals. So what I will try to share with you today and tomorrow is actually based also on my personal experiences as an author, as a reviewer, and as an editor. What are avoidable shortcomings? What are avoidable mistakes that we should also avoid before we submit our paper to a high impact journal? Yeah, so I would like to direct your attention to some of the issues that are important and that you carefully need to deal with when you prepare your research, when you conduct your research, when you prepare and write up your manuscript that is intended to be submitted to a high impact journal. So we want to figure out what are avoidable mistakes that we should avoid before we submit to high impact journals. And this may sound a bit trivial, but based on my experience, especially now also as a reviewer and an editor, it still happens much too frequently that such avoidable mistakes are not avoided by authors, and then of course eventually lead to, unfortunately, a rejection of this manuscript. Okay, what's the agenda of our two-day workshop? Dr. Kapoor has also already mentioned some of the subjects that we want to deal with. On our first day, our session today, I would like to discuss with you some general requirements of academic writing for high impact journals. My background is in organization and management, so I will particularly provide comments and insights from this field and from this lens of organization and management, but of course always with a special emphasis on corporate governance. And you all are interested in corporate governance. You all do research in corporate governance, as I have learned. Most of you are already faculty members. We also have, fortunately, a few PhD students with us today and tomorrow. So you all do research in corporate governance. we all share the interest in the phenomena of corporate governance and in doing research on corporate governance. So of course there are differences between the various high impact journals, but on a more general notion, what I will try to share with you are some insights about how to identify an adequate research subject. What should we pay attention on? What should we care about when we try to figure out, is a research subject more or less eligible in order to build a concrete research project in that domain? How to develop a precise and promising research question? What should we take care about when we formulate and developed our research question, the precise question that actually guides our research, the article that we want to prepare and eventually submit to a high impact journal? What does it mean to make a meaningful contribution? And a meaningful contribution in high impact journals usually means a meaningful theoretical contribution. So I want to share some insights also in this regard. What does this actually mean? What is the expectation in this regard? And related to that, there is a long debate also within the field, particularly also in the field of organization and management, about a potential tension between rigor and relevance. And I will just briefly also deal with that, actually relax a bit the tension and show how rigor and relevance need to be balanced, or actually how this tension could be overcome or relaxed. Then, of course, we also need to write up the paper that we want to submit to a high impact journal. I will share some hints, some suggestions, perhaps some best practices that you may want to consider again in order to avoid avoidable mistakes that can also happen and occur during the process of writing up the manuscript. Then I will share with you some ideas or suggestions how you may want to proceed in order to select which high impact journal, which specific journal title may be appropriate or promising for the research, for the article that you intend to publish. And I will conclude the session today with some comments about how to prepare the manuscript for submission for this specific journal. So what to pay attention for in the process of preparing the manuscript for submission. And as I said, because of the differences between the various journals, we have to take a more general approach here and to share insights on a more general notion in order to make sure they are sufficiently applicable to different journal titles, to different journal outlets that you are interested in submitting your work to. So this will be the agenda of our today's session. And as already mentioned, whenever you have questions, please write them down in the chat function, and Dr. Nidhi Kapoor will forward the questions to me. And particularly when there are clarification questions, please make sure to ask them in order to allow us to provide the requested clarification immediately. And then, of course, at the end of the session today, we will also have ample opportunity for more open Q&As and hopefully an open discussion. Let's briefly already have a look what to expect tomorrow. So on our second workshop day at the same time, 3 to 5 p.m. Indian Standard Time, I would like to deal on our second workshop day with the general procedures of the submission and review process of high impact journals. So I will give you some in-depth insights, actually what's going on, how is this process organized, the process of submission and review of manuscripts in high impact journals. So questions that we will deal with tomorrow include how is in general the submission and review process of high impact journals organized. Again, of course, there are differences between journals, but on a more general notion, I think we can share some basic characteristics, some common characteristics that we find actually in all high impact journals. What are, again, essentially the roles of editors and reviewers in high impact journals? Which criteria tend in general to be used to evaluate the quality of submitted manuscripts? Then we take the perspective again of the authors, so of you. How should you as an author deal with the feedback that you receive from the evaluation and review process? And in particular, if you have the success, the fortunate event to be invited to revise and resubmit your manuscript, how should you deal, particularly in this case, with the feedback that you have received? And we will conclude the session tomorrow with the question how to deal with the eventual outcome of the submission and review process from the perspective of the author. So the eventual outcome can either be the paper is rejected, or hopefully the paper is eventually accepted. And how to deal with these outcomes is something I would also like to discuss with you tomorrow on our second workshop day. So let's start with our agenda of today and with some general notions, actually what you need to pay attention to, what you need to care about when you want to develop a research project, when you want to conduct a research project and finally write up a research article based on this project that is supposed to be submitted to a high impact journal. What's actually a high impact journal? I think we do not have to specify this in more detail. We all have an idea of high impact journals. Dr. Nidhi Kapoor actually already has also shared some basic characteristics that are associated with high impact journals. So irrespective of the impact factor, high impact journals gain much attention, so they attract a lot of readers. Articles in high impact journals receive many or more citations. So, but the actually important impact, the eventual outcome is that these articles are read and that they make a contribution that actually provide new insights that develop our research community further, that advance our common knowledge and wisdom of a specific research field. So this is what we actually mean when we talk about high impact journals. And now there's obviously a high number of high impact journals. And these high impact journals, if we look at them, they publish different types of articles. Obviously, not all journals publish all types of articles. Some journals are devoted just to a specific form or type of articles. But before we get started, I think it's helpful just to list, without claiming to be exhaustive, a list of common types of articles that may or could be published in specific high impact journals. And as I said, without claiming to be exhaustive, I think Most importantly, such a distinction needs to include empirical studies, conceptual papers, review studies, perspective articles, research notes, replication studies, and phenomenon-based articles. Well, as advanced PhD students, as faculty members, you all have an idea, of course, what these types of studies actually are and how they differ from each other, right? So empirical studies, they rely on, they build on, they analyze empirical data, right? Maybe quantitative studies of large-scale data, primary data, secondary data, maybe qualitative studies, perhaps also or only of an in-depth case study. But the common characteristic, of course, is these are studies that build on and analyze empirical data for theory testing or for theory building. Conceptual papers do not build on, do not analyze data. They are purely conceptual. So they may develop models based on theory, based on logical considerations, based on substantial arguments that intend to advance our knowledge and to provide new insights. So they do not incorporate empirical data. They are purely conceptual. Review studies, another type of journal article that may also be eligible to be published in a high impact journal. Review studies analyze prior research in a specific field or that has been published with regard to a specific research question, and try to take stock of our extant knowledge in a specific field or that has been provided with regard to a specific research question. And they try to consolidate actually this state of knowledge that has been developed so far. Perspective articles are a bit different. So what they actually intend to do is to provide some new lens, some new view, how to see things, phenomena, research fields, or perhaps also questions. They want to provide a new lens. They want to provide a new view that may be ignored or neglected in prior research. We have research notes. Actually, these are short research articles, more frequently empirical studies than conceptual papers, but the common characteristic is these are short research articles, research notes. And well, basically the background is that in high impact journals, the length to contribution ratio, of each single article is important. So if an article has not a very major contribution to provide, but nonetheless a contribution that is not only incremental, it may be worth to think about framing it or putting it in a research note, which is much shorter than a full paper, but may justify publication of this contribution that is provided in this article. So research notes, for example, may be articles of 20 pages length, whereas full papers, empirical studies or conceptual papers may be 40 pages long. We have replication studies, which become more and more important. We know replication studies for decades from the natural sciences, actually in order to corroborate prior findings, and if also organization and management research, corporate governance research wants really to become more evidence-based, replication studies are important that replicate prior studies in order to show whether with different data in different settings in different countries, these studies or these findings are to be replicated, or what are perhaps boundary conditions that have to be considered that do not allow to simply replicate the prior findings. So again, to really take stock of our knowledge and to consolidate knowledge to be gathered from prior research, replication studies actually are very, very important, and they also gain more and more attention within the field of organization and management. And the last one here on my list are phenomenon-based articles, articles that are focusing on one phenomenon or on several phenomena, but they do not provide some more theoretical or not more theoretical contributions or insights, but are really focusing on the phenomenon. So this is something which traditionally we were aware of primarily in practitioner journals, but this becomes, at least slowly, also more and more attention in research-based, in academic, in high-impact journals. Or at least we have specialized journals that are devoted to such phenomenon-based articles. So as I said, not all high-impact journals will publish all these different types of journal articles. And you have to carefully check and select which journal outlet may be eligible for which type of a journal article. So if we take the Academy of Management and the Academy journals as an example, the Academy of Management has different journals. Actually, fair to say they are all high impact journals, but they are specialized or they only accept specific types of articles. So to start with the phenomenon-based articles, and this was simply or really some kind of a innovative addition to the journal market within the field of organization and management. The Academy of Management launched a couple of years ago a new journal, the so-called Academy of Management Discoveries, which is focusing only on phenomenon-based articles. So you will have no chance in any of the other academy journals if you submit phenomenon-based articles to them. Then AMD, the Academy of Management Discoveries, is the outlet of choice. The Academy of Management Journal only publishes empirical studies. The Academy of Management Review only publishes conceptual papers. So it makes no sense to publish an empirical study to AMR. It makes no sense to publish a conceptual paper to AMJ. So you need to carefully figure out in advance what types of articles are actually accepted by a journal you may be interested in. And there are also journals. Yes, please.
So we have received a question.
Yes, please.
A clarification basically.
Yes,
Dr.
please.
Shikha Sachdeva is asking, how are conceptual papers different from the phenomenon-based articles?
Yes, it's a very good question. And I would have come to this in a minute. So the conceptual papers, all the studies, with the exception of the phenomenon-based articles, they all attempt to make a theoretical contribution. So they all go beyond the phenomenon under study and put their findings into some theoretically meaningful perspective. So this applies to empirical studies, conceptual studies, all other types of studies, with the exception of the phenomenon-based articles. The phenomenon-based articles are really only focusing on the phenomenon under study, okay? And that's the difference actually between the phenomenon-based articles and all the other article types here in my list. And this is why I put the phenomenon-based articles also into brackets. because it's actually a more recent type of research article, at least in high impact journals. As I said before, it has been common and is of course common, particularly in practitioner oriented journals. But because we became more aware of course also in the academic community that we need to develop or to get more insights also into novel phenomena, a good start may be also to have such in-depth phenomenon-based articles as a new type, as a new forum of research. Okay, so that's the difference.
We have one more question, sir,
yes,
if
one
you
more question.
allow. Yeah.
Of course.
Mr. Nishant Sharma, he is requesting if you can elaborate on the perspective articles and also how likely the perspective articles are to be accepted over empirical studies.
Yes. So the perspective articles, the idea is to provide, that's why they called perspective article, a new perspective, a new view, a new lens, how to see phenomena, how to deal with specific research questions, how to newly frame a field of research. So that's the common characteristic of a perspective article. And now coming to the issue of the likelihood what to get published. Again, and I always have to emphasize this, I cannot give you here a specifically reliable forecasts, but I have a suggestion. And this is why I underlined, as you can see here, two types of studies, empirical studies and research notes. So from my personal experience, what I would recommend advanced PhD students, also younger faculty, if you want to start to receive experience of publication in high impact journals, my recommendation, my personal recommendation would be to think about empirical studies, and perhaps about empirical study that may be captured or framed as the research note. Why do I provide this recommendation? Well, for a conceptual paper, for a review study, for a perspective article, to make really a contribution here, you need perhaps an even more in-depth knowledge of the field of research that you want to advance. Okay, so you do not have the empirical data that may provide value to your research in some way on its own. You are simply relying on the conceptual thoughts. You have to order and consolidate prior studies in the case of a review article, or you have to know actually all the perspectives, all the established views, all the lenses that have been applied before in order to come up really with a meaningful new perspective article. So this is why my personal recommendation, that's really a personal recommendation and certainly not a law or something like that. So to start with an empirical study and perhaps a research note to make sure that the length to contribution ratio fits with the expectation of the high impact journal, and if the journal accepts a research note, would, from my personal view and experience, the most promising way to start. This does not exclude, of course, that you may try conceptual papers, review studies, perspective articles, or replication studies, but my personal recommendation would be think about of an empirical study, perhaps also as a research note, because you have the empirical data that provides value to your article. Perhaps you have the advantage to have access to some really unique data. Perhaps you study data in a context that is largely understudied by prior research. Just think about just the large economy of India.
Yeah.
That is, of course, much less covered than, let's say, the European or particularly the North American and US economy. So you may have some value here based on the data that may help you to sell your research and eventually and hopefully to get published. So this would be my personal recommendation. I hope that I addressed the two questions
Thank you,
by
sir.
the
Thank you.
colleague. Any other questions, Dr. Nidhi?
One more we have received. We can take it right now or maybe later. It's from Mr. K. Narendranath, and he's asking if you can give an example of a phenomenon-based article that we can work on. Any example? Because
yeah, just take a look at the Academy of Management Discoveries, because actually the journal is full of such articles. So such phenomenon-based articles, for example, could be devoted to a new system or a unique system of knowledge management within a company or within an industry, and actually describe characteristics of this knowledge management system in much detail. Okay, so this would be an example of the phenomenon-based article, without relating this necessarily to the theories of knowledge management, of knowledge gaining, of learning, or without intending to make a contribution to advance our theories of knowledge management or learning. So they are really focusing on the phenomenon. And to repeat again, that's the core distinction of the phenomenon-based articles from all the other article types here in the list. And for all the other article types, and phenomenon-based articles still are very, very rare in high-impact journals. So usually high-impact journals in organizational management and corporate governance, they focus on the other 6 types of articles. And for all these other 6 types of articles, and this is very, very important for me to emphasize, for all these other 6 types of articles, to get them accepted in a high impact journal, it is essential that they make an theoretically meaningful contribution. So the contribution that they provide has to be meaningful, and meaningful particularly with regard to the development and advancement of related theories. This applies to all of the other 6 types of articles. And when we look at the common reasons why papers are rejected, then this is frequently the case because the theoretical contribution appears to be too marginal, underdeveloped, or even only implicitly mentioned by the authors. It's important also to keep in mind, this also applies to empirical studies. Empirical studies in high impact journals rely on data, analyze data, but the value of an empirical studies, or the takeaway, is eventually the theoretical contribution, the theoretical insights that are to be gathered from the analysis of the empirical data. So when I mentioned before in my personal recommendation to focus on the empirical studies because you have the value of the data, then this is just one element of the value you provide with an empirical study, but it is by no means sufficient. So for an empirical study in a high impact journal, these studies also have to make a theoretical contribution by testing theory, by building theory. As a result, they advance our theoretical insights. And this is why also later in our workshop, we will come back to this and share some insights or some things we need to pay attention for in order to make sure that we really sufficiently deal with the theoretically meaningful contribution that we intend to provide in our research. Okay, so if there are no questions,
yeah, we can move further, sir.
Thank you. So then let's jump now into our agenda. And the first issue that was mentioned there is how to identify an adequate research subject. So before we get started with all the research that we want to conduct, we have to find a research subject that appears to be promising, to build on this some research to eventually come up with a research article that may be eligible for submission and hopefully also for publication in a high impact journal. I start again with a very, very personal recommendation. So when you ask other scholars, when you attend workshops by other colleagues, you may receive a different recommendation. But my personal recommendation is to identify an adequate research subject. First of all, make sure that you are intrigued by this research subject. So my recommendation is not to search strategically for a research subject that may be worth to pursue. My recommendation is start with something that you find interesting, start with something or start your search in a field that you find fascinating, a field where you want to find out more about, a field where you wish to elaborate on. Remember the bad news that I shared at the beginning of our workshop? The bad news was, well, publishing in high impact journals is hard work and it's a long journey. So during this long journey, you will face many obstacles. You will receive problems and you will face frustration. And so from my experience or from my view, intrinsic motivation actually is essentially important if you want to really persist, if you want to really survive in this long-lasting process, if you want to survive on this long journey, and of course also want to have some fun if you work so hard on such a research project. So you will spend many, many days and probably also many, many nights on such a research project, on such a research article. And I think then it's important that you are really intrinsically interested in this research subject and do not simply choose a research subject because someone told you this is promising or because you think simply strategically this may be something to study, although you are not really intrinsically fascinated and interested by this research subject. So this is a more personal recommendation. And of course, even if we are interested in a research subject, we also have to make some more, let's say, technical considerations. What research subject may be promising and what research subject may be less promising. And as said also at the beginning, there's no one best way. And we actually face many tensions and many conflicting targets and goals that we have to balance on this long journal and in the process of developing, conducting, and publishing high impact research. So what are the conflicting targets we need to consider or balance with regard to the identification of a research subject? Well, my recommendation would be check that the research subject on the one hand is not overstudied, meaning there are not already a high number of articles published on this specific research subject. So if there's already a very, very, very high number of articles published on this research subject, then naturally there may be only room left for rather incremental contributions, incremental advancements that can be made to develop this field further. For you, this will make it much more difficult to really make a novel and meaningful contribution. So if the field is already too established, you will face the challenge to find an important gap, meaning a research gap that is really worth to consider, although it has not yet been addressed by the multiplicity of prior studies. So if a research subject is overstudied, is well established, so why have all these prior studies actually left out perhaps one minimal research gap that you are able to identify? Is this really then an important research gap, and is the contribution that stems from filling this research gap really make a difference for the field? So make sure there have not been already too many people who covered and researched a specific subject. On the other hand, the research subject should also not be too understudied, because this makes it difficult for you to actually build on prior studies and to develop and to position your own research, and also to justify your own research against the background of prior work. So if a research subject, if a research field is too novel, is too nascent, it will be your challenge, and it will be your very, very tough challenge, that you need to convince your audience, so meaning also the reviewers, the editors, that it's really worth to study this research subject, although no one else has done before. So you see, it's a very, very already complex and tricky issue to identify an adequate research subject. My suggestion would be, see what's interesting for you. I think this is a really, really important condition because of all the hard work, of all the time, many days, many nights you will spend on this research project. And then try to balance that the research subject that you intend to address is not either overstudied, because then you will have only very, very few incremental contributions that may be left to be made by your study. And also make sure or check it's not too understudied, because then it will be very, very tough and challenging actually to convince readers, reviewers, and editors that this is really a research subject that is worth to be considered, although it was largely ignored and neglected in prior research.
So we have a question. Dr. Sunaina Kanodia is asking that what if a lesser researched problem like CG concerns and stock price volatility, it emerges from already researched, published, widely topic like CG and firm performance? So in such cases, how can a striking balance be found?
Well, if we have something which is understudied but develops from an overstudied, broader research subject, I think this is a good way actually to balance these two requirements. Okay. Yeah, because you can actually refer to something which is well established. So in the example, the association between corporate governance and firm performance, and then you come up with something new, which is, I don't know, corporate governance and
stock price volatility. Stock price volatility.
Yeah, so that may work. My concern with this specific example would only be that the relationship between corporate governance and firm performance is really heavily overstudied. So maybe it could be better to frame and focus on the issue of governance and volatility to motivate the study rather than the relationship to performance. But from the basic thinking, what the colleague actually asks in the question, the mode of thinking is exactly right. So if we start, or if we start with a broader established research subject and try to figure out what new question may emerge out of this. This was actually, as I understood, the wording and the logic of this colleague. This is a good way of thinking and a good way of moving on and how to proceed. Just really make sure that the research subject you start with is not too overstudied. Any other questions?
We have one more question from Ms. Neelam Java. From Ms. Neelam, she is asking that, with respect to the studies wherein we want to compare between pre-COVID-19 and during COVID-19 period, what is the approach that we can follow in order to add to the earlier literature? Because we do not have an equal data for comparison for these two periods.
Well, the question is, we want to analyze pre-COVID and post-COVID.
Pre-COVID and during COVID-19 period, because abhi to it is still going on, the COVID-19 period. So if they want to conduct a study in wherein they are comparing these two, then what kind of approach they may follow, because equal data is not available for comparison.
Well, you need comparable data if you want to compare pre-COVID and during COVID companies, right? So if you don't have comparable data, then it will be hard to make such a study. It's good to say to compare pre-COVID and during COVID and not post-COVID, because of course right now, unfortunately, and to our regret, we're not able to analyze this. But if you want to make a comparison of, let's say, two different contexts, in this case, pre-COVID and during COVID, then you have to make sure that you have comparable data. You can collect data now on the situation as it is, but then you have to make sure that you have historical data, archival data, that you can match with that. Yeah, so this would be direct response to the question, and the more general response to the question, if we look at the research subject, I would not say here the research subject actually is COVID-19, pre-COVID-19, during COVID-19, but the general notion here, and then we can also relate it actually to a established research field. The general notion or the general field actually where such a study should be positioned in and perhaps framed in is the situation pre and during a crisis. So COVID-19 is an example of a crisis, right? So, and if you want to make a study here in this regard, and again, remember, we come to this also in more detail in a few minutes. The theoretically meaningful contribution is the essential thing for a high impact journal article. So it's interesting, of course, to compare pre-COVID and during COVID corporate governance, company performance, or processes and action. But to really come up here with a theoretically meaningful contribution that goes beyond, again, just the phenomenon pre-COVID, during COVID. That's just the phenomenon to compare. But to make a meaningful theoretical contribution, it's important to build on established research on corporate governance during the crisis. What's different with the COVID crisis compared to other crises that have been studied before? So, and this may help you then actually to come up with something which has also the potential beyond the phenomenon to advance our wisdom. Yeah? So you build on crisis-related corporate governance research. You need to analyze what's converging, what's different with regard to the COVID-19 crisis. And so then what actually corroborates our established or common understanding of corporate governance pre and during a crisis. And what's new here and what needs perhaps also to enlarge and advance our existing theories about corporate governance and crises.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for these very, very good and helpful questions. And I will move on to our next slide. So when we have the research subject, we need to develop our research questions. So actually the precise question that needs to be addressed and dealt with in your article, in your research. And the important thing here is it has to be precise. Yeah? So the research question needs to precisely capture what the study intends to address. And this means clarity and focus are essential. So let's start with focus. If the research question is too broad, is too wide, you will not be able to convincingly address this research question in one single article. Perhaps you can address it in your life as a researcher, but for the article that you want to prepare and submit to a journal, just keep in mind, you have a page limit here. So the research question really has to be focused in order to make sure that it can really be convincingly addressed in your article. And clarity is essentially important. We will reiterate this at different parts of our workshop again and again. So high impact research, good research, very much rests on clarity. So if you refer to constructs in your research question, it has to be sure that there is clarity about what these constructs mean. If your research questions refer to relationships between these constructs, there has to be clarity about how these relationships are to be supposed. So clarity and focus is very, very important for your research question. And actually all of the article types that I listed at the beginning of our workshop, they all need a precise research question. So it does not make a difference whether we are talking about an empirical study, a conceptual paper, or a review study. All of them need a precise research question, and this research question needs to be clear and sufficiently focused. Again, we see we have tensions here, right? So when it's too focused, when it's too narrow, then of course we will have difficulties to come up really with a meaningful contribution at the end of the article. But nonetheless, for the mode of thinking, I think clarity and focus is important, because the tendency actually is more frequently that research questions are captured too broad rather than too narrow. It's important to see that the research question is not the same like your hypotheses, right? So in an empirical study, the hypotheses actually fill out the research question. They contribute to responding to the research question, but the research question is something different, or something more general actually, compared to the specific hypotheses that follow from and that specify the research question. What's important with regard to the research question, it needs to be new and meaningful. And remember, we have again here the tension that I have just mentioned before, with the research subject that may be either too overstudied or too understudied. So on the one hand, we need to provide something new. We need to provide a novel research question that indicates a gap in prior research, that indicates a gap that has not been sufficiently addressed but left out in prior research. However, just identifying a research gap is not sufficient. Yeah? The research gap alone does not justify that it is worth to consider and develop a specific research question. The research question besides being new, besides filling out an existing research gap, also needs to have the potential to make a contribution because it will advance our scholarly wisdom, because it will enlarge our knowledge on the specific research subject. And in this regard, again, the theoretical development and the theoretical underpinning of the research question, of all your research, particularly of the research question, is essentially important. So you cannot come up with a research question that is not backed in extant theory, that is related to existing theory, and where you figure out actually what can be learned from studying this research question, from addressing this research question, to advance our theoretical wisdom. Yeah, so for all high impact journal articles, with the exception of the phenomenon-based articles, the theoretical development and the theoretical underpinning is crucially essential. And again, this does not only apply to conceptual studies. This is equally important in empirical studies, in review studies, in perspective studies, and in replication studies. So the theoretical development and underpinning of the research question is important to come up really with a research question that promises potential for research that may then eventually be worth to be considered for publication in a high impact journal. What is theory actually? Or let's perhaps make a stop here first, whether there are clarification questions on slide number 6.
No, we don't have any questions as of now, sir. Yeah.
I will move on because I have now so strongly emphasized the importance of theoretical development, the importance of theoretical underpinning. So I have emphasized an article will not survive the review process of a high impact journal if it does not make a theoretically meaningful contribution, if it does not advance our theoretical insights, our theories. So what is actually then theory? And of course, we could have a workshop on its own, perhaps a philosophy of science workshop to really delve into this. So I won't do that, but I want to at least share some very, very brief notions just to, again, raise your attention and to make you more sensitive for actually what is meant when we say, well, there should be a theoretical underpinning and a theoretical substantiation. In this regard, I refer to an article which has been published already no long ago, 25 years ago, by Richard Sutton and Barry Storr in the Administrative Science Quarterly. It's a 25-year-old article, but the short article, but I can still strongly recommend you all to take a look at it, because the article is titled "What Theory is Not," right? So it may be particularly challenging to say, well, what is theory? What is a theoretical contribution? But what Bob Sutton and Barry Storr also do in this article, they have a list of excluding criteria or consideration what theory is not. Okay, so what's not sufficient to claim to have made a theoretical contribution. And they list also, based on their experiences as author, reviewer, and editor, they list 5 things or also common mistakes or common misunderstandings by authors, what theory is actually not. So references are not theory. Data are not theory. Lists of variables or constructs are not theory. Diagrams are not theory. Hypotheses or predictions are not a theory. Yeah, all of this may be part of theory, but none of these is sufficient to claim that this is theory, right? So references are used actually in order to substantiate our research based on prior studies. But this does not release us from justifying why we expect to see certain relationships, why we have selected to study certain constructs or variables. Same thing, data is not tantamount to theory. Data may support theory, data may test theory, data may build theory, if you think of good case-based or case study research, but data is not a theory. So more work is needed actually really to use the data for theory testing or for theory building. Theory is not simply listing variables or constructs that are used in your research. Theory, as we will actually see in a second, is about the relationship between those variables and constructs and about the theoretically substantiated underpinning why to expect these relationships among variables or constructs. Such relationships, particularly if you think also perhaps of more complex causal relationships, may be helpful to be visualized in diagrams. Yeah? So many theories actually benefit from verbal as well as graphical representations. But the diagram is not the theory. The diagram is not enough actually to come up and build with the theory. We also need verbal representation to verbally justify all the boxes and arrows that we have in a diagram and why they have been selected and why they are related to each other as they are shown to be related. And of course, also the hypothesis or the predictions of a paper are not theory. They may lead, again, comparable to our data, or they are a building block of testing and building theory, but they are not tantamount to theory. So these are all things that theory is not. Yeah? So keep this in mind. So let's say kind of a laundry list. When you write up your paper, when you always think about the theoretical underpinning, the theoretical substantiation, also then in your discussion and conclusion section about what's the theoretical contribution that your paper intends to make. Listing references is not enough. Referring to your data, to your variables, to your diagrams, to your hypothesis, this is all not enough. You need to delve more into this if you really want to make a theoretically meaningful contribution. Well, what a theory is actually also perhaps in some sense from discipline to discipline or from scholar to scholar, you may receive at least partly diverging answers. But I think, and also in line with Sutton and Storr, if we want to make a theoretical contribution, if we are talking about a theory, then let's say the litmus test, whether we have a theory or not, is the question of, does the theory give us insights about why, and we could add how questions. So theories actually are developed, theories actually are built in order to provide well substantiated, justified answers to why and how questions. Yeah. So how are things, how are constructs related, and why are they related the way they are supposed to be related? So this is actually what we expect theories to illuminate. That is what we expect actually theories to contribute. They are not simply about saying that things are the way they are. They are not purely descriptive in this sense, but they provide a more or far-reaching justification about how things are and why they are the way they are. So it's not only about answering what questions, but also about, and particularly about, answering how and why questions. So following Sutton and Storr, they provide some what I would call ideal characteristics of a strong theory. So of course, we all have in mind there are stronger and weaker theories, there are more developed and less developed theories. But if we have, let's say, in the sense of Max Weber, something like an ideal type of a strong theory, what would be characteristics of such an ideally strong theory that answers queries of why and how questions? Such a theory is about connections among phenomena. Again, it's not just about the phenomena, remember, it's about the connections among phenomena. It's about how phenomena are related to each other. And the theory provides a story about why X events, structure, or thoughts occur and how they are related. So that's very important. It's not purely phenomena based. It puts these phenomena into some perspective in order, or by demonstrating and by justifying how they are interrelated to each other, how they are connected. And an ideally strong theory emphasizes particularly the nature of causal relationships. So what are antecedents? What are consequences? A strong theory identifies what comes first, as well as the timing of a series of events. So strong theory delves into the underlying processes in order to allow us to better understand the systematic reasons for a particular occurrence or non-occurrence of certain phenomena we are interested in and that are under our study. Yeah? So not only the phenomena are interesting, but how they are connected, and particularly also with regard to the causality of these connections or relationships. And in this regard, a strong theory provides a set of convincing and logically interconnected arguments. Yeah, so the arguments that are developed based on a theory, that are underlying a theory, have to be convincing, and, well, that's very important, and we will also come back to this. They need to be logically interconnected. So otherwise, we don't have a strong theory. And such a theory with convincing and logically interconnected arguments may be even stronger if the implications that are to be drawn from such a theory are not simply intuitive, but also run counter to our common sense. We could say such a theory is not only strong, but only interesting. It's interesting because it provides novel insights, new insights that are not simply intuitive, but also challenge or even run counter to our common sense. So the strong theory helps us to see things, to recognize things that we would not have seen, that we would not have expected without the theory. And such a strong theory, to use the words of Carl Weick, such a theory explains, predicts, and, if it's interesting, if it also runs counter to our common sense, it also delights. Good. Do we have a question?
Yes, we have two questions.
Yes, please.
One is from Ms. Swecha. She's asking that most of the studies from the emerging markets in the area of corporate governance are replication studies with context-specific explanations. In such instances, we either support or oppose a theory. In recent times, can you point to any paper which focused on theory development in governance?
Well, all the good papers in corporate governance, they make a contribution to theory development or to the advancement of the theory. But I would like to add something else to this question that I find important, because the colleague mentions, well, there are replication studies, particularly also conducted in the context of India, which is interesting because we have a understudied governance environment. We have peculiarities of a very, very large and emerging economy. So such a replication study should not stop at simply replicating a prior study in the sense whether we find the same results or whether we find opposite results, but the contribution of such a replication study should go again beyond the phenomena of these results and explain, theoretically based, why we find either the same or different results. Okay, so this would be the expectation for a replication study in corporate governance, with a replication study, with a replication based on data from India that can make a theoretical contribution. So if we find different results, then we have to figure out, why is this the case? What are perhaps boundary conditions that have been ignored or omitted in the prior research that we are replicating? And this is exactly actually the motivation or the core idea of replication studies, if they really aim for making an impact and also for making a contribution that goes beyond simply comparing results from one study to the other. So the challenge and the contribution of a replication study is very much associated with the interpretation, and in this sense then also with the theory development or the theory advancement of why similarities or differences occur. And this is where I would motivate colleagues, scholars that conduct replication studies to really think about, to really focus attention and energy on. And so it's helpful to see what we mean with a theory and what we don't mean with a theory. So simply comparing the results, this would be comparing one set of data with another set of data, right? So this is not theory. We need to have some theoretical lens why we expect similarities or differences. And then based on our results, we can delve into this and try to make a theoretically meaningful contribution.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, sir. We have one more question, that for building a theory, do we need empirical testing or logical arguments would suffice? Dr. Shikha is asking this question.
Yes, thank you very much. Good question. And well, for building a theory, of course, it's a multi-step process, but you can start building theory simply on conceptual arguments. That would be possible. Okay, so this would be or could be framed in a conceptual paper. Well, building a theory may sound a bit perhaps too large and too challenging, but you could also have a conceptual paper that perhaps adds some new constructs, some new variables to an existing theory. So this could be done purely conceptually without data. Just as I mentioned at the beginning, I think it's very challenging because you are really on your own, just with the conceptual underpinning and just with the theory-based arguments and their logical connections. So for a single article to build theory, you can do it in a conceptual paper without data. We, of course, also can use data to build a theory, what we particularly do in qualitative studies that really intend to come up with some new elements of theory or some new lens or even some new theory. This is also possible. And of course, the traditional theory testing of quantitative empirical studies also contribute to the corroboration or a revision of an existing theory. But so this was the long answer. The brief answer to the question is it's both possible. And of course, if you do just a conceptual paper on the development of a theory, that's fine. But then the next step would be to make this theory at the end of the day really strong and established, that building on this paper, hopefully, empirical studies will follow up in order to see and in order to analyze whether this theory, whether these conceptually arguments can also be empirically validated or, let's say, corroborated.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much again for these two good questions. And so meaningful theoretical contribution, we have mentioned this several times, is important. So just perhaps let's sum up a bit what is meant with this meaningful theoretical contribution. So for a publication in a high impact journal, irrespective of the type of article, the study needs to advance our extant knowledge. This is what we actually mean with the contribution that is necessary, that is indispensable in order to get published in a high impact journal. And this means we make a theoretical contribution. Okay, and the theoretical contribution may be more or less pronounced, can be smaller or larger. So, but the theoretical contribution in general may be to refuse existing theoretical perspectives, to enlarge them, to specify them, to bridge different theoretical perspectives, or even to build new theoretical perspectives or a new theory. So some of these things need to be included in an article in order to be considerable for a high impact journal. It's not enough to just stick to the phenomena under study, but we have to put these phenomena into some perspective. We have to analyze, show, and justify why the revealed phenomena have an impact to advance our extant knowledge, to advance our existing theories. Okay, and in this regard, as I mentioned before, and building on Sutton and Storr, so what are theories? Theories strive to give answers, as I said, to how and why questions. So if you think, is a sentence, is a group of sentences, is an approach really a theory? To figure out this, then you have to figure out, does this approach, does this stream of research really provide answers to how and why questions? So questions about how and why specific elements, constructs, variables are related to each other. This is important. So a theory does not only descriptively state that elements, variables, constructs are connected. The theory goes beyond the phenomena and justifies how and substantiates why these elements are related. So then a meaningful contribution is when these answers that we provide in our article with regard to their practical or scholarly relevance are important. So they refer to a gap, they make an advancement that is not neglectable. And even better, they may be interesting. So they do not simply reflect common sense, but at least are to some degree counterintuitive. So they provide insights that we would not have thought about without this article, without this research. So this is what we mean when we talk about a theoretical contribution. And besides other things from my experience also as author, I have to admit also from my personal harmful experiences as a reviewer and as an editor, this is perhaps the toughest part of high impact journal publications. And this is as a consequence also probably one of the most likely causes why an article is not accepted, why an article is rejected after submission to a high impact journal. So the theoretical contribution is important. So it's necessary that you deal with this during the whole process of your research, that you always keep this in mind. It's not sufficient just to study the phenomenon. You have to go beyond that. You have to make some theoretical contribution, and that you address this also in the writing up of your article. Even if at the first attempt, this may not be perfect, or that may not be the end of the story, you should address it. You should not leave it out. So simply leaving it out, or simply saying, well, the reader might find it, the reviewer may see what the contribution is, so leaving it only implicit, without showing it, without telling it, this is not a good idea. In contrast, this is one of the major or most common causes why a paper is not accepted. So deal with it, mention it, and even if at the first attempt it won't be perfect, it's important that you face this challenge and try to address it and to provide your arguments, your thoughts in this direction. Do we have questions at this point?
No, sir, no, we can go
Okay,
forward.
then I will move on, and perhaps also in the interest of time, just to make sure we have 12 more minutes.
We have around 15, 20 more
15
minutes.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
Because we started a bit late, so I think.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So, but I will just briefly mention the balancing of rigor and relevance. Perhaps you have heard about it. It is a long debate, particularly in the field of organization and management. So our colleagues in accounting, economics, and finance, they are less concerned with it. But what's actually this debate about? Rigor and relevance. Well, you all know rigor basically refers to the methodological advancement of a study and justifies technically which conclusions are to be drawn from it. Methodological advancement, rigor also refers to conceptual papers. So it's actually how compellingly and logically compelling the underpinning and development of your study is. So it's not only an issue of empirical studies, it's by no means only an issue of quantitative empirical study. Of course, rigor also refers, perhaps requires even more explanation and transparency in the case of qualitative studies and case-based studies. But rigor, so to speak, is to use actually the technical and to apply thoroughly the technical rules of academic research, empirical or conceptual. Besides that, relevance basically refers to the implications or to the impact that can be drawn from a study with regard not only to scholars, maybe also to practitioners, maybe also particularly in our field of corporate governance, to policymakers. And as I said, there is a long debate going on, particularly in organization and management, about the potential tension between rigor and relevance, and more specifically, there has been concerns that much research, particularly research in the high impact journals, emphasized too much rigor and rather ignored the relevance of finally accepted articles. Relevance, we have to emphasize here, is not tantamount to relevance for practitioners. So relevance, of course, also includes relevance for the advancement of our scholarly wisdom, to develop theories further, to advance, revise, or refuse theories. So relevance is not the same like practical relevance. Having said that, and without delving into this debate, I think for us here in this workshop, the bottom line is we need both. So articles in high impact journals need to be at the same time sufficiently rigorous and relevant. So we want to study relevant phenomena, otherwise it would not be interesting, otherwise we would not make actually really a meaningful contribution, meaningful for theory, practice, or a policy. But of course we can only make or draw a conclusion if it is based on research that is sufficiently rigorously conducted. So for us, I would say, without delving into the details, the bottom line is we need both rigor and relevance. Okay, we have discussed some of the, let's say, more technical or methodological aspects of conducting research for a high impact journal. When you have all these issues that we have now successfully dealt with, so you have identified a promising research subject, you developed a precise research question, you conducted your research empirically or conceptually, and actually are able also to make a theoretically meaningful contribution based on this research. Of course, you also need to write this down, to write up your paper. And so this is actually what I would like to refer to next. But before doing so, because it's a bit different from the things we mentioned before, I would perhaps make sure whether we have question to the first part that we mentioned before, and perhaps also in if there are more questions on what we have dealt with before, I think now may be a good time to deal with these.
There is one question that we have received, that what if when we explained the theory within the word limit, but in detail, and reviewer says it looks as if he is reading a book full of information?
So the question is, we refer to the theory in our paper, and the
Yeah,
reviewers,
if a research paper that has been submitted wherein the theory has been explained within the word limit, but in detail, and the comment that comes from reviewer says that it looks as if he is reading a book full of information.
Well, reading something full of information actually is not the worst thing, right? The worst thing is reading something without information. I think it seems to be the question is related to the issue of writing, I would say. So, of course, I don't know the passage the colleague is referring to. So maybe the reviewer thought that the explanation is too lengthy, may not be focused enough, could be, right? So remember also I said clarity and focus actually are essential. So maybe this was something where the reader got lost. But well, taking also this question as an opportunity, the colleague with this question actually also mentions some other very, very tough challenge that we all face when we in general publish articles, and of course this is particularly a challenge if we write up articles for high impact journals, because, well, we have to put a lot of things inside in these articles, right, in order to make really transparent what we have done and why we have done it. Yeah? So what's the justification why we have done specific things that we make transparent the way we have done it. And at the same time, and I think this was also tackled in the question, at the same time, we face a more or less strict page limit, right?
Yeah.
And this is indeed always, and it will be until the rest of your life as a researcher, a challenge, right? To make sure to put all the things inside the article that are needed to understand your research, to follow and to be able to assess and evaluate what you have done, but to bring in only these things, so focus on them, and still to do this within the very, very tough page limit, because it's not a book, yeah, with all the information I can have in a book. So I have to be very, very dense, very, very focused in what I do. So on a general notion with regard to the question, focus and clarity is important. So if you explain the theory that you use, and when you explain the theoretical underpinning that you use, try to be brief. So don't bring too much information, only bring the information that is really needed to develop and substantiate your arguments. And this is a tough challenge, and this is so there again is no recipe, right, how to do it. You just always have to carefully ponder this and carefully reflect, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph. Do I need this sentence? Do I need this paragraph? Is this information needed? Is this information related to the information in the prior sentence? So to really polish the writing and the development of your manuscript. And as I said, there is no recipe, there is no one best way. And this is one of the challenges all of us and also the most senior colleagues still have to deal with and still have to face. So over the time, you may get perhaps some, let's say, practice in this regard, but it will always remain a challenge. Because we have done so much work on this specific project, on this specific article, right? So we have probably worked for years on it, and we have made many thoughts, and we have, of course, also made some implicit assumptions during the process. Yeah. We had made many decisions, why to go this way rather than that way, why to select this variable rather than that variable, why to use this method rather than the other method. So a lot of important and impactful decisions. And at the same time, well, roughly we have, let's say, 40 pages, right? 40 pages only to summarize and also to sell and to justify what we have done. And this is, and this will always remain a very, very tough challenge. And so focus and clarity, as I said, should be the guidelines in this regard.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
I think it would be better, because writing up may be a bit different to what we have talked before, and is also better related to the content of our second workshop day tomorrow. So my suggestion, my preference actually would be to wrap up questions with regard to what we have discussed so far today. Okay. And then perhaps continue, or we can, I don't know, because we can't continue. We can't continue now for another 30 minutes, right? So you also have other commitments?
I think, sir, I think we can continue for another 10-15 minutes if it's fine with you, as you feel convenient.
For me, it's fine. So I would just suggest when we have questions for what has been dealt with by now, additional
We have
questions.
we have taken up all the questions that have been posted till now.
Okay, then I will continue, and you give me a sign because I like to have your questions, and I like to share my thoughts with you. So I could speak for another hour. So just give me a hint because
It's
I
lovely
understand.
listening to all the intricacies, sir. I think all the participants are loving it.
Okay, thank you. But give me a hint because I know
Definitely.
that you may also have other commitments.
Sure,
So,
sure.
some tips on writing up your paper. Let me again start with a quote, and this actually refers to what I have also told you at the beginning as one of the bad news. Yeah, so publishing in high impact journals is hard work, and this particularly, not only, but particularly also applies to writing up your paper. And actually, the question we just dealt with um, was also referring to this challenge. So, Zinsa is a nice textbook or a textbook guidance on writing well in order to write nonfiction. It's a nice established textbook, as you can see, also published in a high edition. And so to avoid expectation gaps or over or under estimation biases, it's simply the case that writing is hard work. Yeah? So no one is born as a good writer. And even if we have gained experiences as a writer, it will always remain hard work. So no one can just sit down, open the computer, and write down these 40 pages of an article within 2 or 3 days. It will take much, much more time. So Zinser says a clear sentence is no accident, but very few sentences come out right the first time, or even the third time, the fourth time, the fifth time. So whenever you are also frustrated in the process, remember this in moments of despair. So when you are frustrated that it takes so long to really write compellingly and clear, when you find that writing is hard, Cinder say, well, you find that writing is hard because it is hard. So there's actually a no escape. Writing is hard work, and it is very time consuming. So also in your planning of a research project, also make sure always that you have sufficient time for the writing up. It's one of the mistakes I also observe frequently, that people in their scheduling, well, they have a lot of time or sufficient amount of time. They invest into the literature review, developing the research question, developing the hypotheses, running the empirical study, collecting the data, analyzing the data, but they often have not a sufficiently realistic expectation how time consuming it actually is also then eventually to write up your manuscript. So it's a very, very hard work that actually also is associated with this. So what are some tips from my side on how to write up the paper? Be clear about the structure and the development of your arguments from the outset. So don't start writing hoping that the structure will emerge, that the arguments will develop during the process of the writing. This will not work. Be clear in advance what's the structure of the manuscript, what's the structure of how you want to develop and justify your arguments. You can take notes in this regard to develop a framework that you then fill out, but you should have this in advance before you really start writing in whole sentences. If you write up your paper, try to develop a story that actually the paper is about. if you sell a story and not just a study, this will also help you to attract more readers, because it's much more interesting to see, well, there's a story that I'm interested in rather than just a study with some results and some contribution. And it makes it also easier for readers to memorize your findings. So if you have a good story that motivates your study, on which you develop and organize the various arguments and introduce and discuss the findings, this will help readers actually to understand and to follow what you have done, and also to remember your findings and your study. Talking about the reader, always keep your reader in mind when you write up the paper. It's a natural thing, because you have spent and invested so much time on this specific research project that you know much more about your study than any other reader. Yeah? So you need carefully to think about, what does the reader need to know about my study? What do I need to explain and also to make transparent to the reader? For example, which implicit assumptions I have used, which of them need to be disclosed and need to be explained? Which decisions have I made with regard to the selection of a specific theoretical framework, constructs, variables, methods, measurements? Which of these deserve, from the perspective also of the reader, more explanation, because perhaps they are not intuitive, perhaps they are more in need of justification. Focus on what is really needed. So also perhaps referring to the last question that we had by this colleague that was referring to the feedback she received from a reviewer. Focus only on what is really needed. Be concise. You have no chance actually within 40 pages to make excursus to some things which are not really related to your research question. Focus, clarity, and be concise. Avoid jargon. Yeah? So don't use technical terms that make it difficult for the reader, particularly for the reader that is not that familiar with the field as you are, to understand and to follow what you have done. If technical terms are needed, if constructs, of course, they are needed, introduce them and provide a clear and compelling definition when the first time you use them. Logical flow is essential. Yeah? Read carefully your paper. Make sure that you know for each paragraph what's actually the message. What do I want to share with this specific paragraph? So what kind of purpose should this paragraph actually serve? Logical flow is essential. Make sure that paragraph 2 really flows logically from the previous one, so that there are no interruptions, that there are no breaks in the logical flow of your arguments. So this refers to the set or the order of the various paragraphs. This also refers within each paragraph to the order of each sentence within the paragraph. So always check, does sentence 2 logically flow from the previous one? So you should have mentally, or you can also write it down, a clear plan how you develop your argument, how you develop then the writing up of the manuscript. Which arguments need to come when? Which arguments need to come first? Which arguments need to come second? Ideally, if you read as a reader, the first sentence of each paragraph should give the reader a sufficient idea what to expect within this paragraph, to make sure what this paragraph actually is about. If the reader needs to read 2, 3, 4 sentences before he can actually figure out what's the purpose, what's the mission of these explanation, then you may have lost the reader. Yeah? So there has to be a compelling and strong logical flow of your arguments. And then make sure that all the sections of the manuscript fit neatly together. Of course, this also means that you have to use terms, terminology, definitions consistently throughout the whole paper. Yeah, don't use different terms in the introduction than in the method section. Always use consistently the same term throughout the whole manuscript. Make sure that the various parts and sections of your manuscript fit well together. This particularly applies to a check introduction and conclusion section. Yeah, so in the introduction, you explain, well, what's the research question, what to expect from this study, what do I intend to deliver? Check in the conclusion section whether you really, in the same structure, in the same order, have delivered all the things that you have promised. Are the conclusions that you provide really to be gained from your study? Do they match with the conceptual arguments, with the data and that you have? Personal recommendation from my side, what helps, and I still do this, read the manuscript loud for yourself, because then you figure out, well, why I have this sentence here after the prior sentence. So such kind of a lack of logical flow, you will be, or at least this is my experience, easier be aware of if you really read out loud the manuscript just for yourself, and hopefully your neighbors or your family will not be disturbed by this. Okay, before we conclude, I have also borrowed from Belrose Regens. She was an associate editor of Academy of Management Review, from also a nice short piece that I strongly recommend you for reading completely. Reflections she came up with also as an editor, author, and reviewer. What's actually the craft of clear writing? And as we said, clear writing is hard work. So Regens also emphasizes clear writing takes a substantial amount of time and effort. Make sure in your scheduling you will need a lot of time for writing up your paper, and also make sure there will be frustrations because you won't write up a perfect article the first, the second, perhaps not even the first, fourth, fifth, or sixth time you attempt. And important, there are no shortcuts to writing clearly. So there is no shortcut to actually achieve this. Every word needs to be scrutinized for its meaning, clarity, and purpose. So you really have to pay here attention for detail. Yeah, just one word, one sentence that does not fit neatly in the development and structure of your argument may be sufficient to lose the reader and to lose the reviewer in the evaluation process. Clear writing refines our ideas. So we also learn from clear writing. So it's not just a burden, it's also an opportunity for us to learn and to grow. We need to think clearly in order to write clearly. But the process of writing, and that's important, with the reader in mind, taking the perspective of the reader, also helps us to clarify our thoughts. Some things that we may think are easy to understand are to be taken for granted. If we take the perspective of the reader, we may see that perhaps they need some more explanation if you have not gone through the long journey of the development and conducting of the research. So always keep the reader in mind and Be focused and clear, but think about within the mission of focus and clarity, what needs to be explained and justified to the reader. Clear writing takes a substantial amount of time and effort, and that is also the case because clear writing will always require again and again rewriting. The process of clear writing helps us sharpen our ideas. It can also illuminate flaws in our logic or approach, so where things are not yet sufficiently organized and settled. And we will, when we drill down to the core of our ideas, we may discover a diamond in the row or a lump of coal. And if it's coal, so Reagan says, don't try to pass it off as a diamond, simply start fresh. So when you are in a position where it simply seems to be flawed, don't try to fix it, start new, start fresh in order to deliver the sentence or the idea that you may have. Okay, this was what I wanted to share with you about writing up the manuscript. I think we can leave the journal selection and the manuscript preparation process for our second workshop day, because it also fits very well, of course, to the question or the overall question that we want to deal with tomorrow, how the submission and review process is organized in high impact journals. So I would suggest that we use the remaining time to address questions with regard to the process of writing up the manuscript, the challenges that are to be faced with regard to this important task and important part of the research process.
Yeah. Well, yeah, thank you, sir. I cannot see any questions as such, but there are a lot of congratulating messages and thank you messages for you for such a wonderful session, such an insightful session. I mean, I think all the participants are writing this. Everybody is so overwhelmed with this presentation. So I think if you can just stop sharing your screen and can have a look at the chat box, you will be able to see those messages that are continuously pouring in for saying that it's a wonderful session and how everybody has enjoyed this session thoroughly.
So I thank you very much for the compliments and the encouraging feedback. Then, of course, this will, for me, be an additional motivation for our second workshop day tomorrow. And of course, we will also have the opportunity tomorrow to deal with questions. So maybe overnight, some of the thoughts, when they have settled, you may have, again, some comments or suggestions that you may want to share. So we can, of course, also discuss the things that we have dealt with today in our session tomorrow. And I look forward to seeing hopefully all of you tomorrow at 3 o'clock p.m. Indian Standard Time.
Yeah.
Hopefully we have again such a nice interaction and such good questions also from the audience. And thank you again to everyone attending. Thank you to Professor Sharma for having me here joining this workshop. And also today, thank you to you, Dr. Nidhi Kapoor, for so aptly moderating and hosting this event. So I'm very happy that I'm able to lie in your confident hands tomorrow.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. I would now request Dr. Poonam Sethi to present a formal vote of thanks.
Good evening, everyone. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Good evening, everyone present here. Thank you, Dr. Nidhi, for that opportunity and honor. And on behalf of Global Research Foundation for Corporate Governance, all participants of this FDP, and on my behalf, I would like to thank Professor Till Talaulikar for sharing his expertise and scholarly wisdom in the area of academic writing in high-impact journals. As we all know, writing a research paper is one thing, and getting it published in a journal of international repute is an altogether different ballgame. As is clear, conjugation of both is of real significance, and today's interaction has given us significant leads and shown us the way forward in that direction. Friends, Association of Professor Till and GRFCG is now an established one. To be precise, now a year old, when he was the keynote speaker at the first international conference hosted by GRFCG last September. However, his association with Professor J.P. Sharma is older than that, and we are reaping the benefits of that association. Clearly, no words are sufficient to show our gratitude to him for sparing his valuable time for conducting this content-laden FDP and thus helping us add another feather in our cap as we move from strength to strength in the field of corporate governance. We look forward to the second day of this program and believe the takeaways from this FDP will stand in good stead for all the participants. I would be failing in my duty if I do not thank people who deserve a special mention, as their continued support and faith in GRFCG has magically helped it grow from a fledgling organization to an accomplished one. Professor J.P. Sharma, founding chairperson, GRFCG, whose relentless pursuit for excellence has given us wings, and our eclectic board of governors who rally constantly behind the foundation are the major driving force. Specifically, Professor Nikhil Bhushan Dey, Professor S.P. Kala, Professor Dr. Subhash Mahajan, Dr. Professor Saurabh Agarwal, who are members of our board, have graced the FDP today, and we are really thankful to them. And other eminent professors who found time to be with us today, Dr. K.S. Bharti, Dr. Ajay Gupta, Dr. H.K. Dangi, Dr. Amit Singh, Dr. Urvashi Sharma, Dr. J. Kiran Mai from IPE, Dr. Sheetal Mahender, Dr. K. Tara Shankar, Dr. Rajneesh Jindal are some of the eminent professors who were with us today. And I would also like to thank all the participants who made the session interactive and meaningful. Looking forward to another round of interaction tomorrow at the same time, same platform, and same link. Signing off for the day, and see you all tomorrow. Thank you, Professor Till. Meet you tomorrow again.
Thank you, Professor Till. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I thank you.
Right. Thank you.
See you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.